Welcome to the new lecture of array of structure using C++ language. In this lecture we will try to cover how to declare array of a structure for a number of students. So if we have for 100 students or more than 100 students and we declare a structure, and so then it is not possible for a programmer to declare 100 variables or more than 100 variables for a single structure. So in that case we can introduce an array of structures. So using array we can reduce the declaration of 100 or more than 100 variables into a single variable. So let's see in this video how can we declare an array of a structure. So this is an example of a structure for a student. So struct is a reserved keyword that we have used to define the structure of for a student, and the student is actually name of this structure, and this is the block, the structure block. So it actually defines that with what kind of variables we are going to declare in this structure. So we have three data types, three variables. One is the ID variable that is declared in the structure of type integer. Second is the name variable of type string, and third one is the OB, the obtained marks for a student of type integer. So these are the just example variables that we have declared in the structure. Okay, so the name of this structure is student. So this is now a user defined type. Okay, and the user defined type is student now, and we can now declare multiple variables of student type. So as we have declared this structure globally, so therefore we can access to this structure throughout the functions define or declare in your program. Okay, this is the main function where we have declared an array of size 4 of type student. Just like we declare an array of other variables, the primitive variables, we have declared an array of student. For example, normally we declare, so this is the syntax to declare a variable for any primitive data type with a variable identifier. In a very similar way, this is the user defined data type. This is actually identifier, the variable name of variable, and this is the syntax. The square bracket actually represent the syntax of the array, and in between the square brackets you can see the integer, the value which shows the size of the array. So we have declared an array of size 4. So it means that we have 4 copies of the student structure. Let me visualize this. This is the visualization of the array of size 4 for variable identifier S. Okay, so we have defined this with 4 elements, 4 slots having index number starting from 0, 1, 2 and 3. So we have 4 indices starting from 0. Okay, each index has the copy of ID, name and obtained marks. Okay, this is how we can represent the copies of the variable that are declared in the student structure, the user defined type, in the array. So these are the copies actually, which is the ID on the index number 0 is different from the ID on index number 1, is different from the ID on number 2, and similarly from the ID number 3. So these are the copies of the structure defined previously by the programmer. Okay, so we can access this array just like we have accessed the array for the primitive data types using loops. Okay, so here we can see that I have defined the for loop to initialize the values inside this array. So here you can see that we have defined the for loop to iterate through each element of the array. Okay, starting this loop from I is equal to 0 and ending this loop on I is equal to, or sorry, I is less than 4. It means that we will iterate through index number 0, index number 1, index number 2 and index number 3. So it becomes 4 iterations for this loop. On when I becomes 4, so this loop will be terminated because the condition will become false. Okay. So because we have no index number 4 here in this array, therefore we will not try to access index number 4. Okay, so it becomes logically incorrect. Okay, so this is the body of the loop, and as you can see that we are going to input the value from the user using cn object. Okay, here you can see that we have accessed this array, this one, S of 4. Okay, so we have accessed this array, and in the index we have used a variable I. So in the first iteration the value of I will be 0. Value of I will be equal to 0. This is in the first iteration. Okay, so it means that S of 0 and S of 0, so we will access this slot of array which has index number 0. So S of 0 dot id, S of 0 dot id, S of 0 dot name, S dot 0 of OB, obtained marks. So all of these 3 variables will be accessed using this syntax. Okay, and in the first iteration, as the value of I will be 0, so we are going to access index number 0. Similarly, in the second iteration, as I will be updated to 1. So therefore, in the next iteration, I will be equal to 1. So S of 1 dot id, S of 1 dot id, S of 1 dot name, S dot 1 of OB. Okay, so all of these 3 variables will be accessed using the index number, which is now I is equal to 1. So similarly, in the third iteration, sorry, I have done a mistake. So in the third iteration, we will have I is equal to 2. So when I is equal to 2, so it means that we are going to access the element number 2, the slot number 2 in this S array. So index number 2 of dot id, index number 2 dot name, index number 2 dot ob. So here you can see S of 2 dot id, S of 2 dot name. So in this way we will try to access the data, the variables that already been defined in the structure using the index number of the respective element or slot in the array. Okay, so in the fourth iteration, I will become 3. So in this way we will access S of 3 dot id, this one, the last index. Okay, S of 3 dot name and S dot 3 of object. So we will access to the index, last index in this array. So in the fifth iteration, I will become 4 through this update statement, this one, update statement. Okay, and then the condition will be checked. So 4 is less than 4, no, the condition will become false, and therefore this loop will be terminated. Okay, and we will input the values from the user on index number 0 for all these 3 variables. Similarly for index number 1, index number 2, index number 3. Now we are interested to print out the values that user has inputted in the variables. Okay, so we have defined another loop, for loop, starting from I is equal to 0, I is less than 4, and this is the increment or decrement operator that can be used, the update statement. Okay, so we are going to output the values on different index numbers. Okay, so you can see in the first iteration I will be equal to 0, so S of 0 dot id, S of 0 dot name and S of 0 dot OB, the obtained marks. So the values will be printed on the screen, and then we are printing the end L, the next line command. Okay, and in the second iteration we will be printing the s of one dot id, s of one dot name, s of one dot obtained marks. Similarly, in the third iteration we will printing the id index number 2, the variables on index number 2, and in the fourth iteration the variables on index number 3, and in the fifth iteration this loop will be terminated and all the values will be printed on the screen, okay, on the console screen. So this is how we can declare an array of a structure and then can input it the values from the user, and we can print the values inside the array on the console screen using for loop concept. So this is the whole summary of the declaring the array of structure. If you have any question regarding array of structure, so you can ask me just below in the comments, and I will inshallah try my best to answer all those questions. Thank you very much for watching this video.